externalities. People who impose costs on the economy and don't produce net benefits. That actually happens to be completely not true. Immigrants, take the work of any economist on the left or the right, or pro-immigration or anti-immigration. And what you find is the universal consensus that immigrants actually contribute a fair amount to the economy. Something to the order of like $50 billion annually. Even George Borjas of Harvard University, who is not friendly to immigrants and makes rather ungenerous assumptions about their contributions. Even he has admitted that immigrants on the whole contribute about $7 billion to the economy. The question, and nobody disputes that high-skilled immigrants are a net benefit to the economy. They make high wages, they contribute a whole lot to taxes, and they do not collect benefits, or very rarely collect benefits. The real issue is about low-skilled immigrants, and Rehman has written, and I have to compliment Rehman after going through some of his writings, and he's actually very, very fair when he talks about low-skilled immigrants. Rehman has conceded in his...
I don't think you've been very fair to me in saying that I'm saying that. No, please continue.
You get a rebuttal.
Of course.
Low-skilled immigrants, Rehman has conceded in some of his work that they do not collect benefits, or they collect far fewer benefits than native-born population who are part of the same socioeconomic strata. That they, in fact, do not reduce wages of native workers, even high school dropouts, which used to be the case. George Borjas used to claim that they reduce the wages of low-skilled immigrants, reduce the wages of people who they compete with most directly, who happen to be high school dropouts. Actually, that turns out not to be true. So in other words, low-skilled immigrants make a net contribution to the economy, are a less strain on the welfare state than native-born of the same socioeconomic strata, and do not contribute to the low wages of high school dropouts. What they do, as Rehman himself has... Yes. What they do is actually they compete with themselves and reduce their own wages to the tune of 6%. And this, Rehman has previously said, results in the kind of poverty that he's talking about. That they get assimilated into this underclass of poverty. Now, there's a simple solution to that. The reason they are actually competing so much with each other and making low wages is precisely because they are unauthorized. Once you authorize them, there's a wage premium of about 8% that Madeline Zaptuni, who's actually of AEI, has calculated that they immediately earn an 8% premium, which is enough to offset the 6% wage loss that they have. Or let me finish. So the point is that there is no policy in which there are no losers. Immigration is one of those policies where there are actually the fewest possible losers, because even low-skilled immigrants come over here at their peak productive years without having been in the society at the time when they are consuming more than they are producing. So, any way you look at it, even low-skilled immigrants are eventually a net boon to American society. So
if I may, just briefly, when you're talking about that 6% hit to previous immigrants, in fact, this is not exclusive to unauthorized immigrants. It includes a wide swath of unauthorized immigrants, a majority of whom are here lawfully. Are lawfully here. Right. That's right. And so when you're talking, and also let's keep in mind, and when we're talking about that 8% hit, when you look at the demographic mix of the low-skilled population, and also when you look at, okay, let's start with the unauthorized population, because that's the population that does gain some wage premium from having legal status. Well, first of all, that finding of 8% was based on the 86 IRCA law. You might have heard that between 1986 and now, a variety of things that have happened to depress the wages of less skilled people. Automation, among other forces. So the picture is not, in fact, identical to what had happened then, but let's go with the most optimistic possible assumption that it will be exactly what it was in the mid-1980s. If we make that optimistic assumption, you'll still see that actually the vast majority of children in authorized households are raised in families earning less than 200% of the poverty line. Even if you have an 8% wage premium for those households, these are still people who are extremely poor, and if they gain legal legal status ought to be, I'm not saying will, but ought to be eligible for transfers if we care about the welfare of their children and their ability to become full members of American society. So I think that's a pretty important thing to keep in mind. When we're talking about the fact that this wage hit happens for previous immigrants, keep in mind that the United States is about 13% foreign born right now. When we look at the workforce of the United States, it's about 15%. When we look at the working class workforce, it's a higher proportion of that still. And this workforce is exactly the workforce that is facing the most challenges in a global environment where we have the disaggregation of production networks and much else. So if you believe that the position of less skilled workers in the United States, foreign-born or native-born, is going to markedly improve in the medium term, then I'm totally wrong. If you believe that the march of technological progress is such that routine tasks are actually going to become more competitive and that there are going to be more wage pressures facing people with limited skills, then this is a very hard question to answer. Because the issue is, and again, I'm very different, I imagine, from a lot of other small government conservatives. Because I actually think that we have a real responsibility to see to it that people born in the bottom fifth of our society have a fighting chance to make it into at least the middle fifth. And when we look at the outcomes from the first to the second to the third generation, we see the rates of mobility for more recent immigrants are actually pretty problematic. Why is that? Because the world of the present is actually quite different than the world of the 19-teens. One reason, Shiga talked about the loose borders of that era. Well, a big part of the story was that we've had a transportation revolution since then. That's a big part of the story, right? And actually, production has spread through much of the world. We no longer live in a country where the economy is defined by labor scarcity. That was one of the central facts of the 19th century American economy, and it's no longer one of the central facts. So I think that, really those big macro differences in our country have to be taken into account. Another thing is this. Given that we have, and again, I was talking about native, entrenched, multi-generational poverty. My starting point is that that creates a huge set of moral obligations for us. So for me, when I think about immigration, I think about how do we recruit people who will help us solve that problem. Even if you accept that less skilled immigrants are making substantial net contributions, and in fact, I think the literature on that is actually contested, partly because, for example, if you look at the World Bank literature, they will do things like claim that, well, public education doesn't count. Because we have public education to benefit the country. Well, we also have welfare programs to benefit the country, because when people are hungry, they can't work terribly well, and much else. But regardless, this work is generally done by people who are advocates for loose borders, let's say. And so sometimes you have to go beyond the abstract to kind of bury yourself deep into the text. But bracketing that, I would argue that our immigration policy should be all about recruiting people who can help us deal with our generational challenges. One of those generational challenges is trying to close the gap between people who are the descendants of enslaved persons and everyone else in the society. I think that's actually a big thing. That's going to be labor intensive. That's already been quite expensive, and that needs more work. Okay? So that means not just people who are making some slight net contribution. When you listen to the scale of immigration we've experienced over the last several decades, $7 billion on net, even annually, is not terribly impressive. When you compare that to a more selective policy, there are 3 countries in the world where immigration has led to a slight hit in terms of income for high-skilled people and a big benefit for less-skilled people. Those countries are Canada, Australia, and Switzerland. Those countries have a lot of things in common, but the big one in common is that they actually have a more selective immigration policy. And if you look at the literature kind of assessing U.S. immigration policy since the 60s, you'll see that had we had a more selective policy, it would have disproportionately benefited less affluent Americans, including those who were previous immigrants.
So let me ask this to Shika. I want to make sure we focus, because I know there's been a million points that both of you want to respond to, but I want to push forward and focus on what he was just referring to, high-skilled immigration. This is something where high-skilled immigration, we have some agreement among people who sometimes disagree. I don't know what you think our policy ought to be.
Yeah, before I get into that, I want to address one thing that Raymond said, which was about, briefly, about labor scarcity, that the age of labor scarcity is over. To some extent, that's actually true. And the reason it's
You sound like you're shocked.
I'm sorry?
You sound like you're shocked.
And the reason is, and if that is true, if labor scarcity is truly over, in that case, people will stop coming. I mean, that happens repeatedly. In the last 5 or 6 years, the net immigration from Mexico has been pretty much zero. It's beginning to pick up again as the economy is picking up, but for at least 6 or 7 years, that ended. And if you read Jacob Winter, who is actually a scholar at Manhattan Institute, he points out, I mean, and he has done very, very balanced accounts of the assimilation of immigrants. One of the things that he points out is that the future problem is going to be not the one that America currently has, which is a lot of people flocking to it, but actually insufficient number of people flocking to it. And the reason is, he says immigration happens when a society is in something called demographic transition, which means that the fertility rates are up because people are still expecting there to be bad public health outcomes, high mortality, infant mortality, and what have you. But the countries are developing. And the adjustment of the fertility rates happens after the countries have developed, and there is this brief period when there is a boom in these countries. That boom has pretty much ended everywhere in the world except for sub-Saharan Africa. It's ended in India, it's certainly ended in China, which has a one-child policy. It has ended in Mexico. So the future trends are going to be not enough people coming into this country. So if there is a problem, I don't think you need the government to regulate the borders. The market will regulate itself. Now the high skill part. Look, Rehan paints a very, very rosy picture about Canada and Australia and all these other countries that had high skilled immigrants. The problem over there is that they in fact are shifting away from these policies. Canada had something called a point system at the federal level where it used to rate immigrants based on their skills and their proficiency and what have you. And it was what I call the equivalent of an industrial policy for labor, where the government was sitting and picking winners and losers for labor. It didn't work out very well. Central planners don't know how to plan local labor markets. The result of that point system in Canada was a high influx of very highly qualified people who ended up driving taxis in Toronto. Canada has moved away from this system and is now moving to something called the provincial nominee program, where the provinces are actually given quotas, and Rehan and I have been on a panel discussing this. They are given quotas to set their own, to determine which labor needs their particular economies want to face. So skilled immigrants, there is something called the credential fetish, that you get more credentialed people, and that's going to be the best thing for the country. That actually doesn't happen to be true. What you need is a diversity of skills. You need people at the lower level where there is scarcity, and you need people at the higher level. At least that's been the case in America. And the best way to do it is to take your cues about which immigrants should come, not from central planners, but from employers.
I want you to address that point right now.